Tonight's file. If you are listening in the dark, say this once before we open the file. I do not recognize the bodies in the water. Not because the phrase is poetic, not because it sounds frightening, because the file was written for people who might forget it while they are reading. Welcome back to Midnight Echo Radio. I'm Seraphine Corven. Tonight, we are opening SCP-2316, a Foundation case file known as Field Trip. It is a lake, a memory, and a sentence that has to be repeated because something underneath the surface keeps trying to make you disagree. Keep the volume low. If you start to picture someone you lost, remember the warning. You do not recognize the bodies in the water. The warning at the top of the file. The first thing SCP-2316 does is not describe a monster. It does not start with teeth, claws, footsteps, or a face in the window. It starts with an order. The Foundation marks the file as Level 4 classified. It calls the anomaly Keter. It labels it a cognitohazard, which means that the danger is not simply what you see. The danger is what the information does to the mind after it enters. That is the proper clinical language. The midnight version is simpler. Some things do not need to touch you to pull you closer. The file warns the reader that it contains images and text capable of carrying anomalous influence. It requires personnel to verify cognitive resistance before continuing. Then it makes them repeat a phrase. I do not recognize the bodies in the water. That phrase matters because SCP-2316 does not only show you something terrible. It tries to make the terrible thing personal. It does not just present bodies floating in a lake. It convinces you that you know them. A stranger is a tragedy. A friend is a command. And SCP-2316 understands the difference. What SCP-2316 is? At its simplest, SCP-2316 is a group of human corpses discovered in a lake. The bodies appear to be teenagers or young adults. They float in the water, unmoving, preserved in a condition that should not make sense. But the anomaly is not just the bodies. The anomaly is recognition. When a person observes SCP-2316 directly or through certain records, they may begin to believe they recognize one or more of the bodies. They may identify them as classmates, friends, siblings, old neighbors, someone from a trip they half remember, someone whose name should be impossible to forget. The Foundation's protocol insists the viewer does not know them. The viewer may insist otherwise. That is the crack where the lake gets in. There is something intimate about the horror here. A creature in the woods can chase you. A locked room can trap you. A voice on the phone can lie. But SCP-2316 does something quieter. It edits certainty. It reaches into the place where memory and grief share a room, and it places a face there. It does not need to invent a new fear. It borrows the old human fear that somewhere, someone you cared about is waiting for you to notice what happened. And once you notice, you may feel responsible. You may feel called. You may walk toward the water. The shape of the lake. The SCP Foundation treats the site like an infection point. Observation is controlled. Access is restricted. The language around the file is layered with warnings, automated checks, memos, and containment structure. This is one of the reasons SCP-2316 works so well as a horror object. The Foundation does not sound frightened in the way ordinary people sound frightened. It sounds procedural. It writes fear as policy. It turns panic into classification. But under all that structure, you can feel the same basic thought repeating. Do not look too long. Do not trust recognition. Do not go into the water. The lake itself becomes less like a location and more like a test. If you stand on the shore, the world still has ordinary rules behind you. Trees, gravel, wet mud, the soft insect hum of a place after dark. Ahead of you is a surface that refuses to behave like a surface. Something is visible there. Something is waiting there. And the mind, being human, tries to make it meaningful. That is the trap. We are pattern-making animals. We see faces in windows. We hear names in static. We turn random creaks into footsteps because a false alarm is safer than missing the thing in the hall. SCP-2316 turns that survival instinct against us. It gives the mind a pattern it cannot afford to accept. A face, a body, a memory, a school trip that may not have happened the way you think it did. Field trip. The file's title is Field Trip, and that detail is cruel in a way that does not need to shout. A field trip is supposed to be harmless. Permission slips, buses, half-packed lunches. The special kind of noise children make when they are allowed to leave the normal school day behind. You remember the texture of those days, even if you do not remember the destination. The vinyl seat sticking to the back of your legs. Someone opening chips too early. The teacher counting heads at the front of the bus. The little thrill of going somewhere with everyone who normally only exists inside one building. Now place that memory beside a lake. Place bodies in the water. Place a warning over them. You do not recognize them. The horror of SCP-2316 is not only that something terrible happened, it is that the file makes the reader feel as if they have arrived late to a disaster they were always part of. It suggests absence where memory should be. It suggests a group you belong to, but cannot quite name. It suggests that everyone else stayed behind in the water, while you walked away and forgot. That is a different kind of haunting, not a ghost in the room. A blank space in your own life that starts breathing. Why the phrase works. The phrase is repeated because repetition is a kind of handrail. I do not recognize the bodies in the water. The more often it appears, the stranger it becomes. At first, it sounds like reassurance. Then it sounds like training. Then it sounds like someone trying not to cry. A normal warning says, do not enter. This warning says, do not believe your own recognition. That means the danger has already reached the reader before the reader can decide whether to obey. The file does not only warn you about a lake. It warns you about the part of you that wants to contradict the warning. Because if you did recognize someone in the water, what would you do? Would you call for help? Would you move closer? Would you try to get a better look? Would you tell yourself that no agency, no protocol, no redacted memo could stop you from finding out whether that was really her face just under the surface? That is where SCP-2316 becomes painfully human. It does not need everyone to make the same mistake. It only needs one person who cannot bear uncertainty. One person who thinks, just for a moment, I know them. One person who steps down the bank. The Foundation's problem. Containment for SCP-2316 is not simply a fence around a lake. The real containment problem is attention. How do you contain something that uses recognition as bait? How do you brief personnel without exposing them? How do you investigate a phenomenon when the act of investigation may create the impulse that ruins the investigator? The Foundation can redact names. It can classify reports. It can test personnel. It can write memos that sound calm, because calmness is the last uniform fear wears before it becomes visible. But the file keeps bleeding through its own controls. The warning phrase returns again and again. You do not recognize the bodies in the water. Not, do not touch. Not, do not enter. Recognition comes first. The act of knowing is the first breach. And that makes SCP-2316 feel less like a creature to be locked away and more like a wound in the idea of memory itself. The pull toward the shore. The most frightening part of SCP-2316 is not that someone might be forced into the water like a puppet. It is that they might choose it and call that choice love. Imagine the observer standing there with the protocol still fresh in their mind. They know what the sentence says. They know what the file says. They know, intellectually, that recognition is the symptom. Then the wind shifts. The lake surface moves. A face turns just enough to catch the light. And suddenly the warning has to compete with something older than procedure. Someone I knew is out there. That is the cruelty of a cognitohazard like this. It does not feel like madness from inside the affected mind. It feels like clarity. It feels like finally understanding what everyone else is too cold, too bureaucratic, or too afraid to admit. From the outside, the person is compromised. From the inside, they are the only one behaving like a human being. The file can say, "Stay back." The Foundation can raise barriers. But grief is fluent in trespass. It knows how to climb fences. It knows how to ignore warning signs. It knows how to make a dangerous place feel like an obligation. And somewhere under the surface, the bodies wait with faces the mind is ready to provide. The bodies. We should be careful here. The bodies in SCP-2316 are not frightening because they are graphic. The best horror in this file is not gore. It is stillness. A body in water should drift. It should decay. It should obey time. These do not in the way the mind expects. They remain present. They remain visible enough to invite identification. They stay where the viewer can be hurt by them. A lake is usually a place that conceals. This one displays. And in that display, it asks a question the viewer is not allowed to answer. Who is that? The correct answer is no one you know. The dangerous answer is a name. The moment a name arrives, the lake has stopped being scenery. It has become a relationship, and relationships have gravity. The Midnight Echo. Read. Here is what stays with me about SCP-2316. It understands that grief does not always begin with loss. Sometimes it begins with the possibility of loss. A face in a crowd that looks too familiar. A name in an old record. A photograph where someone in the background resembles a person you miss. A voicemail from an unknown number where the breathing sounds almost like someone you buried. The mind leans toward those moments. It wants the impossible reunion more than it wants safety. SCP-2316 weaponizes that lean. It makes the viewer feel chosen by the dead. It turns distance into guilt. It makes the shoreline feel like a moral test. If you loved them, why are you still standing there? That is the sentence underneath the sentence. That is the voice below the waterline. And the Foundation's answer is cold because it has to be. You do not recognize the bodies in the water. Say it again. Not because it makes you brave, because it keeps you on land. After the file closes, there are horror stories that end when the creature is seen. SCP-2316 is not one of them. It lingers because the file teaches you a defense, then makes the defense feel fragile. It leaves you with a sentence you can repeat, but not completely trust. It asks you to imagine the moment when language fails and feeling takes over. That is the oldest breach in the world. A locked door can hold against a monster. A fence can keep a body from crossing into a restricted site. But a memory does not need a gate. It can arrive after midnight, when the room is quiet and the mind starts showing old faces to itself. It can arrive in the shape of a lake you have never visited. It can arrive as a sudden certainty that someone is waiting for you just beneath the surface. If that happens, do not go looking for the face.